Okay, good afternoon. Welcome to a part of the McKercher Lecture Series, what we're calling a pop-up event, and with our friend Andrew Arruda, who I will introduce to you in just a moment. I want to welcome you to the Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis, and I want to say hi to the students from Nunavut who are somewhere on a camera watching us on live stream. So it's nice to have you involved in this event. My name, of course, is Glenn Luther. There is pizza at the back. Help yourself if you haven't already done that. I'll take a moment or so to introduce Andrew to you, and then we're simply going to have a conversation. We plan to speak for maybe 30 minutes, 35 minutes, and then we will give you a chance to ask questions, so save those up for us. Andrew Arruda graduated from the College of Law in 2014. He's now an entrepreneur and lawyer. Originally from Toronto, Andrew is chief executive officer and co-founder of Silicon Valley-based company Ross Intelligence, a leader in the legal technology industry and a home of the world's first artificially intelligent lawyer. I did tell my first years this morning that, 6 years ago he was sitting in room 64 to learn first year crim from me, and so it's a meteoric rise really for Andrew. I'm so excited to have him here. He speaks internationally on subjects of artificial intelligence, legal technology, and entrepreneurship. 2016, he delivered a TED Talk on Ross and its potential to make the practice of law cheaper and more accessible by reducing the amount of time lawyers spend on legal research. Andrew is featured in publications such as New York Times, CNBC, CBS, Fortune, Inc., Forbes, and the Financial Times, and this year was honored as a member of Forbes 30 Under 30, which recognized the world's outstanding and influential young innovators and leaders of tomorrow. Prior to co-founding Ross Intelligence, Andrew worked at a Toronto litigation boutique and with the Canadian Department of Foreign Affairs, Trade and Development in Lisbon, Portugal, which I think it was before law school.
During for a summer there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to start the conversation. We thought we'd start at the beginning. So I mentioned that, I guess 6-7 years ago you came to Saskatoon, as I understand it, as a young man from Toronto, and decided for whatever reason to grace us with your presence. Why was Saskatoon your destination for law school?
So it's kind of a confluence of factors. I originally was thinking about getting involved in politics, and one thing that was very kind of obvious to me is that there is certainly a Toronto bubble in Canada, and I'd heard more and more about it from folks who I was studying with at the University of Toronto who were from out of province. And so I knew I wanted to go out of province. I ended up looking at different options. My French wasn't wasn't very strong. So I kind of ruled that out. And I also wanted to go where a lot of folks from Toronto didn't necessarily go because I wanted to do something different. I ended up seeing Saskatoon, but obviously in the summer, which is kind of a good selling point. And ended up really gung-ho about coming in. And I've told you this, and I kind of just want to say it off the jump. It's one of the places that I think I really came to as a person. I think it was really here that I formed my strongest friendships, and it was also here where I really kind of had enough time to really settle into who I was as a person and a human being. And I think undergrad was just so go, but when I got here and started, studying law and being exposed to the professors here and the students here, I actually ended up truly becoming who I am today. So I'm really happy to be here.
Well, that's exciting, and of course, several of your very close friends are down in the front row from the class.
We'll have to watch out for the Q&A afterwards from them. Yeah.
We're taking mug shots at the end.
Yeah.
So don't disappear, you guys. Okay. All right, well, let's talk a little bit more like that. How was law school for you? Can you tell us a little bit more about your law school experience at the U of S?
Yeah, it was really great. It started off kind of, I think on the first or second day, you go through your kind of opening conversation, and I'm not sure if the line like look to your right or look to your left, those are the two folks that are going to be at your wedding or something was said, but it might as well should have. And it all kind of came together quite nicely. I think what was a really nice change here was that the class sizes were big enough to not feel like you were always on the spot to speak, but certainly intimate enough that you got to know your professors, which was really advantageous to kind of actually having off-the-cuff conversations. I remember with you in particular, I always would call you Professor Luther, and you kept telling me, Andrew, please just call me Glenn. and I couldn't do it. And even now, if I call you Glenn, it weirds me out. But that was the kind of attitude that greeted me here, and I feel like it allowed for the idea that you could actually pursue what you wanted and do everything you wanted to do. And I think at a lot of institutions, you can splash that on a wall or you can put that on a poster. But I think here, we actually have the opportunity to be and study with people we like and actually be supported in that. So I really had a lot of fun. I got really into criminal law, which was something that I was always really passionate about. And I think that was also what opened my eyes to some of the access to justice issues that were ever present. And now, and we'll eventually start talking about all the other stuff in a bit, but I think that's kind of what opened my eyes to some of the ineffectiveness in the system, as well as kind of ways that potentially you could add efficiency to the legal space.
I remember you coming to me, and I guess in your third year in my law and psychiatry course, and wanting to write a paper on concussions.
That's right.
And I remember that very well. I just wanted to mention to you that your CTE paper, what does that stand for? Do you remember?
Chronic traumatic encephalopathy.
Okay, which since that time is all over the place, right?
Yeah, thank you for remembering that. I actually was talking, my partner now, she's a physician, and I was talking to her about the fact that I was talking about CTE back in the day before it was something that a lot of folks were talking about, which is a very nerdy statement to say. But now, certainly in a lot of places, my argument from that paper was that eventually it would be used as a defense in a criminal in a criminal proceeding. It hasn't happened yet, because it's usually you see it at the end, post-mortem, but watch out for that maybe.
Okay, well, I remember that well. Okay, so after law school, you went back to Toronto?
Yeah, so after law school, well, actually, my time in law started, I was in undergrad, and there was a small law firm in my neighborhood, about 3-4 lawyers, and I ended up going in there, and they were looking for a law school student to have a job there. I was in my first year of undergrad. And we were talking about, I was talking to the main partner there, and he was like, oh, University of Toronto, that's a fabulous law school. I actually went to Osgood. I was like, oh, great, yeah, I'm actually an undergraduate student. And he was like, oh, then why are you here? And I was like, well, look, I'm interested in getting involved eventually and looking at law, and I wanted to learn about it before I started. So I ended up working there and kind of doing everything from getting folks coffee, and I think I did shifts as a receptionist, I did research and kind of worked my way through there. That's what sparked my interest, and after law school went back there. But after actually kind of during articling, ended up meeting someone named Gmo, who was an acquaintance of mine already, who was studying artificial intelligence at the University of Toronto, and that's how I got into the whole mess.
Okay, well, tell us that story. So you meet Gino, I guess, through another friend that was a lawyer?
Yeah, actually, he wasn't a lawyer. He was in finance, and me and him were buddies. And he was friends with Gmo, and we were at an event, and he was like, hey, you guys talk about crazy things all the time. Why don't you talk to this other crazy person? And so we kind of got put in the corner together. And he was really interesting because he had studied self-driving cars, and this was, I guess, 3 years ago. So self-driving cars now is also a lot more in the news, but had stopped doing that because he felt like that was over. He felt like self-driving cars were going to happen anyway, and he wanted to be on the cutting edge of something else. And so what he started talking about was the ability to take in and use some of the same technology that was being used to identify images in artificial intelligence and do that with words. And then we started talking about different industries that would be potentially really groundbreaking in. And then obviously law was one that made a lot of sense because our information is so vast. It's also digitized, which is some of the things that you need to teach in AI. And so we kind of talked at a few different events. I'd see him maybe every few weeks, maybe a month. But then eventually I got this phone call from him, and he was talking about how him and another researcher had started to build this system, which was looking at case law. So you could ask your question to it, and would be able to find all the passages from cases you needed, but it would be a lot kind of like having a conversation with a human being. And he was like, do you think that would be interesting? And I was like, yeah, I think that would be very interesting. So I ended up at this AI lab, and it was actually pretty embarrassing because when I walked in, I expected huge servers and maybe even a robot there. But there was just a tablet on the table. And I was like, okay, where is it? And they were like, it was like that scene from that movie, it's in the computer. So I was like, okay, well, it's in the computer. So then at the time it was speech to text. We've since actually turned that off because it was a bit too advanced at the time. So you just ask it out loud, and it brought back all these different passages. It was trained in Canadian labor and employment law at the time. And I asked it like a kind of a status quo question of some sort. And it looked great, and I said, how long have you guys been working on this? And they were like, 2 weeks.
2 weeks.
And I was like, And then I was like, they were like, well, do you want to, we know that you're passionate about this stuff. Do you think you'd want to join? And so I think within a week, I had the conversation with my parents where I was leaving the profession of law, the practice of law, which did not go over so well. My dad is a very stern guy. He dropped his fork while eating. So literally, he was just like, boom. And I was like, this is going great. And my mom has always been very supportive, but even she was kind of like, that's a good idea, maybe not now, and maybe never that idea. Maybe we don't ever do that. That could be a good idea not to do. And so I was stubborn enough and wanted to do it, and ended up, I had that great relationship with the firm I was at. So I actually went for lunch with my partner there, the senior partner there and the founder of the firm. And I was like, hey, I have something pretty serious to talk to you about, and went to lunch, and he's like, Andrew, are you sick or something? I'm like, no, I want to start this company, and I want to do this and that. And he said, get out of here. And what was really it was really huge for me too, was he was like, if, depending on how it goes, you always have a chair here. And he actually kept my office empty for about 6 months to a year. Then eventually I was like, no, I'm not coming back, which was tough. So that's kind of how it all started.
So as I understand it, you then made the decision, or the company made the decision to move to the United States. Is that soon after that?
That's kind of it all happens really, really quick. So 2 weeks in, I joined. A week later, I left the firm. A week after that, through a friend of ours, we ended up getting our first office space, which was in this basement of a house, like a kind of I wouldn't call it a flop house, but that might even be too nice about that house. It was like really bad. And it was the basement, and it was where people just threw stuff when they didn't want to go outside and put it in the garbage, I think. It's horrible. So we kind of cleared that basement out. There was no heat. It was the winter. So we bought this heater. We moved in there. We had one table. We started working around there. That was like 3 weeks in. We didn't have any funding, so we went through our credit cards. And then we ended up doing a TechCrunch event in Toronto, which is kind of like, if anyone's watched Silicon Valley, it was kind of like a very funny and cliche thing to do. We won this event. We went to New York. We started talking about the product. People got excited, and then they asked us if we were, a bunch of different people were like, oh, are you talking to Y Combinator? My two co-founders obviously knew exactly what that was, coming from being in the industry, but I didn't. And so that's kind of like an investor / incubator, and they provided the first funding to companies like Airbnb, Dropbox, and Reddit. And so we were like, no, so I ended up talking to them, and within a week or two after that, we ended up getting funding from them. And part of that is you move down closer to their offices, and they work with you for your first few months, kind of get you situated and give you some mentorship. And so shortly thereafter, I found myself in Mountain View, California, which was pretty a different place. And I used to be about a 5-minute walk from the Googleplex. So I would kind of go there and sneak in and kind of kind of go on missions and try to get free food and stuff, which was fun.
And so that's Silicon Valley.
That's Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley, though, is not that exciting. It's fun, but it's kind of like a whole bunch of different campuses, and so it's not like you walk around and there's flying cars or anything. It's just like people on bicycles who are like thinking really hard, like going different places, and then investors all wear vests, and so you know what they look like. And then you just have serious conversations, and sometimes you don't know if someone's brilliant or they're just using a bunch of words together. Like AI, blockchain, quantum is the future, and you're like, maybe, So that was kind of fun, though, because when I went there and I didn't know anything about it at all. I had no idea. But I knew about law, and I knew that what we were building and building towards was something that people would be excited about. So actually, I put my foot in my mouth a couple times in different meetings, which was really funny. I would go into meetings with my co-founders, and they were so lovely. They would be like, "Hey, Andrew, so just communicate this to them and this and that, and we'll talk about the technology. You have to pitch some of the business stuff." And I'm like, "I got this." So we're talking, and then I'd be interrupted by one of the venture capitalists, and they'd be like, "Well, you know what? I don't think that's ever going to work because of this reason. I'm like, well, do you have any experience in this at all? And they're like, what do you mean? And I've been doing this for 30 years. I'm like, in law specifically. They're like, no. I was like, well, let me explain this to you. So I would take on these people, and then I would walk out of these meetings. And then my co-founders was like, that was a good meeting, because people would come around eventually, they'd be like, and then they were like, do you know who you were just talking to? And I was like, no. They were like, that's the founder of this company, or they invented this type of computer language. And I was like, yeah, seemed like a really nice person, So it was fun, and it has been fun there. So that's how I found my way down to Silicon Valley.
And I've watched some of your things online. There's lots of different talks that you've given, and sort of interesting living in Silicon. You've got sort of, I guess, self-driving cars all over the place. You do. Yeah,
you genuinely do. That is true. So self-driving cars you see everywhere. Also, sometimes you get to see new things that no one knows about. I was walking late at night, trying to think really hard and walk intensely around, trying to fit in, and I saw this huge 18-wheeler. On a very small industrial street, not making that much noise. It was very quiet, and it was making some moves, and it was kind of an electric self-driving truck. And this was a year and a half, maybe 2 years ago.
And just this week, or the last 10
exactly.
days, the announcement on that.
Exactly. So a lot of the time you get to see those things a year or two before they actually come out, which is cool. But I did expect, full disclosure, that when I went down there, I was everyone maybe on a Segway at least. I wanted some more high-tech stuff in terms of transportation. But now they actually use a lot of scooters. So if you are into scooters, they scoot around everywhere.
So I take it these two fellows that you started the company with are, what are they, geniuses or what?
Yeah, I'd like to say I'm the looks and they're the brains, but I suffer from on that point too. But they're the brains. And one thing that's interesting about artificial intelligence, and that's why I was interested in talking to you guys in particular at the start of your legal careers, is that they actually need folks who have the specialty in the subject that the system is trying to learn. So everyone in this room has the potential to enter and do something pretty dramatic in that space, because you could be really smart at, with machine learning, et cetera, but you do need subject matter experts, and I was very lucky that they chose me to do that early on. So I actually helped teach Ross some of its first lessons. I don't think I was as good of a professor as yourself or Professor Surtees or Professor Newman, but I tried my best.
Me neither, by the way.
But yeah, so I actually ended up trying to come up with a curriculum, how to teach an AI system, how to understand the law, which was interesting. So that's kind of where I came in, and they were specialists in a variety of fields. So the third co-founder, Pargles, who I haven't mentioned yet, he was a visiting scholar from Brazil, and he came to Toronto to study artificial intelligence, because actually Canada is on the forefront of artificial intelligence. A lot of folks sometimes might not know that. You see it in the news all the time, but a lot of the professors who are the leaders in this space came from Canada. Specifically from Edmonton, University of Toronto, and Montreal. So this is one of those times in technology history where the Canadians are actually on the forefront. And why that happened was artificial intelligence was kind of big multiple times. So this has been around for a long time, hypothesized, early 20s, 30s, 40s. You have, folks like Turing who hypothesized, thinking machines. But what ended up happening kind of multiple times is the level of computing power wasn't there to actually make these machines learn. So you would have all this promise, and then it would fail dramatically. And what ended up happening was on the last kind of AI hype kind of swing that happened around the 80s, and a lot of those professors and a lot of those great minds didn't have institutions that A, were funding, or B, were that gung-ho about continuing to have folks study that. But Canada and Canadian institutions really continued to do so. So now, just for you all to know, the head of Google's artificial intelligence is a professor from the University of Toronto. The head of Microsoft's from Montreal. Facebook, he spent time at the University of Toronto. Elon Musk started this AI group with Sam Altman, who's the head of Y Combinator, was an investor in us, and the head of that group is from the University of Toronto. So the Canadians are actually, and AlphaGo, that AI that played Go recently that's been on the news, a lot of the early engineers there were actually from AMI, the lab in Edmonton, which is where I was just yesterday. So we've actually been on the forefront of that for quite some time.
Elon Musk himself is actually from Saskatchewan.
He actually, yeah, so his mom's side is from Saskatchewan, and when he first moved to North America, he actually showed up in Saskatoon first, and this was before the internet, so he didn't have Facebook to reach out to people, but ended up looking up the phone book for an uncle that he thought that was going to be here. The uncle had moved, I think, stateside, so he ended up kind of doing odd jobs throughout Canada for a while. He ended up at Queen's, where, according to a lot of the students there, they said that he was the most unremarkable guy they've ever met.
Is that right?
Yeah.
I can't say that about you.
Well, at least not in front of my face.
So tell us, I mean, I think we're mostly first-year students in the class
Yeah.
right now, and they're starting to get introduced to, Westlaw and LexisNexis, and
Yeah.
My day it was Quick Law was
Yep.
the first thing, Canly, I guess.
Yep.
How is this different than those search engines, just to get
Yeah.
us on the right page?
So a lot of what's the breakthroughs that have happened is around computer systems being able to do two kind of main things. One is actually understand human language. So say that you wanted to ask a question of, there was a biography on William the Lion Mackenzie King. Right now, if you wanted to find information from that, you could do like a Control F and try to look up words in that book. And that's how we kind of interact with information. But what now is happening with the world of natural language processing and machine learning is the ability to start asking books questions or text questions. So to be able to ask, what year was the prime minister, you might not even say the name, born, and contextually that system, because it understands that book, would be able to highlight the passage where it might say, it doesn't even say prime minister, it might say, William was born on this date, blah, 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 blah. So it's about that understanding in a way that had never before been possible. And there was a lot of attempts to do this before. So if you think of other engines like Ask Jeeves in the past, different search engines had tried to do this natural language processing. The problem is you need massive amounts of computing power to do it, and that wasn't available. And then because you didn't have the computing power, you couldn't run the right algorithms and refine them. So it's kind of a two-pronged problem. So what we've done is kind of use a lot of these breakthroughs so that now our system's only available in the US right now, and eventually we want to bring it up to Canada, and actually right now only available in some practice areas. But what you can do is ask fully formed questions, including jurisdictional and date-wise. So you could say, in the state of Texas, can X do Y if this, not that, since 2003? And our system would only bring back the relevant case law that's applicable to your question. It would auto-filter it. It would show you and it won't, it'll just bring you back the direct passages from all those cases. If you want to dive deeper, you click on a passage. The case is all pre-highlighted with all the most important passages according to your question. So if that case came up in another chain and it was a different question, the highlights would obviously be different. Then what we did was something else that's pretty neat is, you can do this, you can ask Ross to monitor the law for you. So you can ask your question, you do your research, and then you click a button, and then as new cases are released, if it's something that is relevant to what you've been researching, you will get an alert, and it'll say, hey, you've been researching this, this, and that. Here's a case that you might not have read, and you should check that out. And then now we're doing some pretty neat things with getting Ross teaching Ross how to write things like legal memorandum and summaries of different cases. So that's kind of where we're going to next. Although we're working with law schools in the States, and I think we're going to actually turn that functionality off for law schools.
Okay, first though, tell us about, so you've used the phrase machine learning. I guess having watched several things and tried to read a lot of material, still don't quite get that. Can you explain what that means?
Yeah, I'll do the best I can. The machine learning, what differs is previously when you dealt with computers, you've all heard computer programming. So what computer programming was someone would sit down and think of all the rules and statements to make something happen. So if the user clicks over here, they're directed here. If they press this button, they're presented with this information, etc. So it's mapped and it's programmed. With machine learning, what you're teaching a system to do is do things and learn on its own, not involving the humans in that process. Now that sounds very far-fetched and futuristic, but let's go down a layer. So everyone in this room probably has a Facebook account. Some of you are a lot younger than I anticipated. So I don't know if it's still cool, but maybe Kik is cool with the kids these days. But on Facebook, when you used to upload a photo, you would have to manually tag your friends in that photograph. So you would put it in and you would tag them. But now if you upload a photograph, you'll notice that it'll actually probably already suggest a few people and their face, and actually it's correct. So that was machine learning done with images, and what they did was they took all the tags that you and your friends had ever contributed of you and your friend network, they put it into a system, which then used that as the example. So this is what this looks like, this is what that looks like. And then they use something called deep learning and neural networks, which again sounds very futuristic, but what that means is you try to train the system to think in multiple layers like a human would. And what that means in a picture would be the shape of my face generally, and maybe the way I wear my hair or the clothing I generally wear. And then they learn all these features so that they can come up with a hypothesis from what it's presented with. So generally with machine learning, you show it examples of the task you want it to complete, and then you allow the system to complete those tasks on its own, and then you feed it back through what's called reinforcement learning. So yes, that's correct, no, that's incorrect, so that it refines itself. So the cool part about these systems is at the beginning it's a lot of work, because it takes a lot of data, it takes a lot of work. But what's neat about it is once you hit a really good stride with them, more people would even want to use it because it gets better, and the more people who are using it, the better it gets. And so it hits a stride. It's actually the way that kind of we as humans learn is, but humans do a much better job, and that's why I think the idea of artificial intelligence replacing people is like very overblown, because these systems are good at doing specific tasks like that, but what we're really good at is kind of generalizing across multiple areas. So you can teach it how to do a specific task, but it doesn't know, if I was to take a photo of you, it doesn't know who you are, doesn't know anything, like it's completing a very small task. I hope I did kind of a lot there, but I wanted to make sure that folks understood it.
It doesn't have much of a bedside manner, if I
No,
can use that.
no, it doesn't, and actually it can lead to some kind of pretty awkward moments, and you've seen that in the news, right? It's taking and feeding it in different, Microsoft tried to teach an AI system using social media, like using tweets, so it didn't go well, right? So there are challenges in it, but I think what's particularly neat about it is that once these systems start learning, they all are interconnected. So if you take the example of a self-driving car, it's driving down the street. Say that something's changed and the speed limit coming into the university here has changed. I might get a ticket on my first day, and then I might say, hey, Chris, did you hear about this new? No, I didn't. I was like, I just got dinged by a ticket. Now Chris goes home, he starts talking to his family, hey, watch out for that. So that's how information spreads with human systems. But with a self-driving car, think about this. If it notices that the sign has changed on something, it'll then take that information in and share it with all the cars in the network instantaneously. So then these things continue to learn as a network, which is pretty exciting.
Very cool. So I take it you're going to say that this is not ever going to replace lawyers.
I think if it ever does, it would be kind of like flying cards days, and what it means to be human would change so fundamentally that the idea of us sitting around and worrying about if we had a job would be like so far-fetched. So all that to say, it's like very, very far away for that to ever happen, if ever, because let's take Go. Go is an ancient game, 3,000 plus years old, very hard to master, and AI learned how to do that. That's great. But the thing about that game is that there's answers in it. There's a victory. You win. Law, and as well as many other professions, the answer is it depends. So what these systems will continue to do is retrieve information for us in an effective manner and present it in an effective manner, but fortunately or unfortunately, it's still going to be up to us to actually argue things, write things, and use our intellect to do those things. So I wouldn't sell ourselves short for that.
And just so everyone knows, and you mentioned this earlier, as I understand it, at the moment, Ross has just a limited number of areas that you can research. So
yeah.
Bankruptcy you started with.
Yeah.
What other areas?
We did bankruptcy. First we started Canadian labor and employment law. And then what's neat is, let's use that Facebook example with the images. We had training data as to how to teach a system how to understand legal research in a common law system. So we took that training data, and when we moved to the States, we actually layered on top of US bankruptcy law. And it wasn't perfect, but it actually started in a way that what you could use. And then we perfected, well, not perfected because it's always a work in motion, but we kind of got things to a point where it was usable and we could sell it in US bankruptcy. Drawing on that success, we raised venture capital money, and then we went into two additional areas, intellectual property and labor and employment, and then drawing on that success, we recently announced $13 million of funding. So we're going to continue to move into multiple areas. What we didn't want to do is show up, say we could do everything all at once, and then it's very hard to do. So we wanted to essentially get it right and then spread, and that's what we've been doing.
Okay, so it's going to be a number of years, presumably, before we can have you in Saskatoon, Ross in Saskatoon.
Well, yeah.
Criminal defense case. Or
I would
something?
call all the American lawyers you know, and the faster they buy it, the faster we can get here.
So it is an area by area, state by state almost, or at least country by country.
Well, no, it actually is a limitation on how many people like we can hire. So right now, we could actually go into every practice area. The thing is, I would have to hire X amount of people per practice area to do tech support, sales, marketing, et cetera. So that's what's actually leading to some of the slowdown there. So when I meet with venture capitalists, my joke is, if you gave me $1 billion, I could do a whole bunch of stuff. And then they obviously say no. And then I say, okay, well, how about this much?
Yeah.
So that's the main limitation.
Okay, cool. And when I did your bio earlier, and you and I talked about this, I left out part that you had written. But I understand it, and if anyone's watched the TED Talk, you get a sense of Andrew's commitment to access to justice as part of this. And I guess I'd like you to explain, how does this going to help in access to justice terms?
Yeah, well, I'll kind of start a little bit why it's important, even for our team. I'm a first-generation immigrant, and I grew up in a neighborhood where folks didn't necessarily always knew how to access the law or where to go, and they weren't really engaged civically as well. And so that was a huge challenge I saw. And when I ended up going back and working at that firm, you kind of feel you start to question what your impact can be at times. When people would come in, and this is their legal issue, and then I'm like, well, I'm going to have to do X amount of research. I have to do this, this, and that. This is my hourly. And they're like, well, I only have this much money. And then you're like, well, I can't help you. And then they'd leave. And then sometimes awkwardly, they might not even be able to qualify for help through another network because they might fall into that gap. And so I kept seeing that, and that was hard to deal with because here you are fresh and trying to make a difference, and then you kind of feel powerless in that way. And so then Jimo, my fellow co-founder who had called me and brought me into this whole thing, when he was a kid, he grew up in Houston in a really tough neighborhood, and his parents split up when he was younger, and his mom couldn't afford a lawyer, and they actually lived still married but separated, and as everyone knows, that's a mess when it comes to the legal implications of that. And so that's kind of what spurred him to even think about the law. And my third co-founder grew up in Brazil, and he saw what a legal system would look like when there was elements of corruption, et cetera. So when we were around that table in the second or third week of our inception and working, what we said is, we don't know if anyone's really going to care about this, but if they do, we'd like to give it for free where we can to the organizations that are actually making a difference in law for all three of those different reasons when we were doing it. And so since we started, that's been at our core. We work with the largest legal aid provider in the state of Illinois and many other groups. I recently was at Northwestern. We did a partnership with the law school there. And what we're doing is helping outfit their students with Ross technology in the areas that we're available in, but also Ross does this pretty neat thing, and Google does this concept of 20% time where you can work on anything you want for 20% of your time. And what we're encouraging at Ross is that our employees spend that 20% of their time doing things from an access to justice standpoint. So, designers working with legal aid groups who might not be able to afford a designer, some of the engineers on my team helping sketch out with groups what it would look like to design an app that helps with landlord-tenant issues, et cetera. So that's been really fundamental to what we do. And like I said, kind of right off the jump, I feel like the work that we did in some of your classes and what you exposed us to was something that resonated with me, particularly when I started to think about how different neighborhoods and different groups are at such a huge disadvantage, and then people get onto this kind of cycle once you're into the criminal justice system or in various other legal matters. And then, of course, in civil issues, you don't even have access to a lawyer in many cases. So it's something that we can't obviously do everything as a company. We're a young company, we're small, we're doing everything we can. But I think that I've been encouraging other AI companies, and this year we were fortunate to be listed one of the top 100 private AI companies in the world. I've been encouraging other AI companies to make similar pledges, because I don't want there to be a dichotomy where only the folks who could afford these services can use them.
That's awesome. Let me change a little bit the stream, come back to College of Law, University of Saskatchewan. You and I have sort of scripted this in a way, and we were thinking a little bit about the job market. I mean, every year it's obvious to me the pressure students feel in talking to me, and I'm sure my colleagues see that as well in terms of, I think the courts start to hire students, in October of their first year.
Yeah.
And students feeling that pressure.
Yeah.
Do you have thoughts about students getting jobs, how that might change in the future?
Yeah, well, first of all, I would encourage everyone to not stress out about this idea that computer systems are going to replace you. So don't worry about that. And it's not just me like making a false promise there. When engineers used to use a thing called a slide ruler, and that's where they spent most of their time, and then the calculator came out and they were able to do a lot more. Software engineers, when you used to have to build a website, you used to have like 20 people who had to take care of the server of it, and it was a whole bunch of challenges to do that stuff. But then, technology allows you to be able to build and do things on your own that's streamlined. So I think what you're going to be able to see is a lot more different opportunities in perhaps starting your own practices that are streamlined using this technology. If you are looking at big law firms as an option, I think it would probably be a good idea to kind of just know about what different technologies that are available. Some people are obsessed with this idea to tell law school students to code. I don't think you guys need to learn how to code because I think you guys should learn how to be really good lawyers in legal theory. That's important. But knowing the different tools available are important. So that's kind of from a practical, that kind of sense advice. But the other side, I think, would be, with the pressures that you see is really try to do something that you really want to do. I myself knew that big law firms weren't for me. I actually did, I signed up in Toronto to go visit all the big law firms, and there was like a 2-day event, and I think it was 4 or 5 law firms a day. And I went to the first one, visited, went to the second one, and then I left, and I didn't go to any of the other ones. I ended up grabbing a pint with a friend of mine who was an actor, so he was always available during the daytime. And my mom called me, and she said, "What happened? You didn't want to do that?" And I said, "I didn't." And I think there's not a value judgment call on that, I think. My sister went big law, and now she works in-house. She's fabulous. She's happy. So my point is do think about what you want to do, because you may be able to say you want to do it for your first year you're there and your second year, but it will begin to grate on you. And I mean, I've been really lucky because I feel like I don't have a job. It's been really, really fun. But I end up working the most hours that I've ever done in my life. But if you find something that you're passionate about, I think that old cliche is right. And I used to think whenever I would go to any event and I would hear someone be like, I found something I love to do and it doesn't feel like work, I used to think that they were just lying, because I was like, well, obviously you'd say that. It would be awkward if you hated it. Also, if you have the opportunity to speak to a large group of people, I thought they were like really putting on the whole show about it, like I love what I do. But I mean, then I'm guilty of it. I love it, and I have so much fun doing it. And I think there's now a very exciting reality where different industries are starting to meld and mold into each other. Obviously, I'm looking at it from a technological standpoint, where if you think about stuff like, okay, drones. I don't know that much about drones, right? I think they're neat. But my point is that's going to come with a whole bunch of legal implications. Those companies are going to need lawyers to work alongside their engineers to build these systems. That could be something you do. You could do a whole variety of different things. And you could also look at different options, starting your own shop. I think a lot of the challenges in starting your own outfit have been alleviated as well with technology. There's now like CRM systems, so you can keep on top of your billing, and it does it automatically for you. There's systems that help you, with client intake. I have a friend who started a company that allows you to kind of have a full immersive experience with your clients. They can send text messages. It all goes into a system. It's wonderful stuff. So my point is there's a lot of options, and I don't care if you're ever in a situation with someone and they're trying to make you feel awkward about whatever choice you want to do. Look, at the end of the day, no one even knows and cares about. Everyone's so concerned about what they're doing. No one really cares really about what you're doing. So do what you want to do. That's what I'd say.
And I take it your company, and we talked a little bit about this, has internships and so on?
Yeah, we have a variety of internships. We have the Toronto office. So if you're interested in technology and legal research, Right now, a lot of the summer interns that we get involved teach and are part of the training process for different features that we've built into Ross. One thing that we're teaching, for example, that's kind of small and fun is automatically being able to generate a citation that is specific in a way that adheres to the rules of the citation you need to generate, so a lot of this is also because in law school I didn't like doing all this stuff, right? And I think the guys in the front row who were with me know this. Like, I had a philosophy that was pretty different when it came to that stuff. So point is, we're doing a whole bunch of really fun stuff and things that I think you guys would get a kick out of. So I'll make sure that my contact information is available. But if you guys are interested in that, it's team@rossintelligence.com. And that's part of the reason why. And also, even if you don't want to work in technology and you just want to have a conversation with someone who did something different, I'd love to chat with you guys. I think the world is very expansive past law school, and there's so many opportunities to use your law degree. I meet lawyers, folks who don't practice in a variety of different things, and that's great. And I also meet lawyers who work at traditional law firms who are happy as clams. So I think you need to find what makes sense for you and do it. And it's your life, it's your reality.
Now, just to finish off, you've talked to me about how happy you were to have come to this law school. Can we just finish off with some thoughts about that? Like, what is it about U of S College of Law that makes you so excited to be from here?
I think the big one was, there was, I don't want to say like, people weren't assholes. Like I'm gonna. So I was like, how can I say that without saying it? But I think that's powerful enough. Like, I feel like people here generally, you might not have gotten along with everyone. That would be crazy. Some people you might not jive with. They have different interests, obviously. But people didn't go out of their way to make your life difficult. People were really collaborative. And I feel like that is different than necessarily what you see maybe in the practice as a whole sometimes. So I think that was really, really huge. And then I also think from a support standpoint of the administration, of the professors, of everyone involved in the institution, that was huge too. Like when I was here, it was Dean Ananda's dean, and my sister came and visited once, and she was parking outside. I don't know how she landed to one of those parking spaces right outside, but like she got it, and was asking like, oh, I'm looking where this room is, and Dean Ananda was like, oh, who are you here to visit? She's like, oh, Andrew, and he's like, oh, Andrew, yeah, like blah blah, like, would you come in from Toronto? Like there was that whole like actually people knew who you were and cared, and I feel like that was huge. And I also think for me, there was so much kind of pressure in undergrad to get into law school, obviously, and to get your marks up and do that when you get here, obviously, there's so much pressure to graduate and do well, obviously. But, you guys are here, and it's like very hard to fail out of law school, generally, because what you worked so hard to get here that your skill set wouldn't even really allow that. So why I mentioned that is that allowed me to have a sense of openness to different like things, and I got to kind of really explore who I really was, and got to join different clubs and do different things and meet different people, and so that was huge. It was a very open, inclusive community and environment that I think really made me feel like I was at home. And so this morning, I walked across the bridge next to the university, and I walked to my old house where I lived starting in first year of law school, and then I ended up walking the same route that I would walk every morning to law school. And I got halfway through, and my shoulder started feeling weird because I was like, I thought I needed my backpack. And then I started straight up getting a little anxiety, like, do I have an exam or something? And I was like, I thank God I don't have to do that, And it's a lovely time. Don't worry about the exams, because a lot of you on first year exams aren't that bad. Don't worry. But all this to say, I was so happy, and I've been smiling this whole time because it just felt like I grew up in Toronto and all that, and now I've been fortunate. I get to see the world and go to a whole bunch of different cities and do a lot of great things. But Saskatoon is where I feel most at home, truly.
Okay, well, that's great. Did you take a few questions from the
audience? Yeah.
Anybody have any questions or thoughts they'd like to
Don't be shy. The first one's always the toughest one. So start it off. All right.
Paul.
So I don't know if you can actually talk about this that much, but where do you see Ross? Is it more of like a
Great question. So the way we see it, we started with search in a similar way that you saw Google start with search, and we did that on purpose. Our goal is to build out an adjoining group and an ecosystem of various AIs that accomplish various tasks within the space. We've been very careful in who we sell to and the process by which we distribute ROS. ROS is used by paralegals as well as lawyers, law librarians, and that will continue to be the case. So we see ourselves as an assist, similar to kind of like the Da Vinci robot for surgeons who, the robot conducts a surgery or helps with that, but ultimately, at the end of the day, the lawyer in this case would obviously be responsible for their work output. And the reason for that isn't just because we want to avoid the unlicensed practice of law issues, which obviously is something we want to avoid, but even with that, there's companies like LegalZoom in the United States and Rocket Lawyer, and I'm friends with some of those folks, and they're doing fine and doing really well. And I think for us, the way we saw things was we could have gone client first and tried to help that way. But what we saw was if we built a system, clients wouldn't necessarily know the right questions to ask. They wouldn't also know how to interpret that information. And then when we built other systems, we want to do stuff eventually in, say, contract law. So you take a contract, and you know that you work for a particular organization and you always agree to certain clauses. You always say no to certain clauses. And this happens very regularly. And so you'd be able to have the AI give it a first glance. And then in it would say, okay, these 4 clauses you always say yes to, these 3 you always say no to, and these 4, I don't know what these are. And so then you'd manually put that in and say what those 4 are and whether you would agree or not, and then you would start the process of learning. So I think we'll always be an assist. I think obviously we already are seeing ROS being able to build on top of what it knows, so it'll continue to learn. So I don't think we'll ever be at a point where we would say, hey, we want you to just use this AI system, rely on it fully, and giddy up. And part of that also comes from a technological problem with these systems, is you can train an AI model to be up to say 85 or 90% correct. Just like a human being, we're not, even though we may think we are 100% correct sometimes, we ourselves aren't perfect. And so the way that we see things at ROS is that if we ourselves aren't perfect and these systems can't necessarily be perfect, the answer lies in combining the two. So that's kind of the way we see that. And that's allowed us to obviously move as fast as we have. And actually, the American Bar Association in the States is a group that we're actually very close with, and as well as the Canadian Bar Association. And they've actually been strong supporters, not just of our company, but of the idea that it's time to bring in more efficient tools in our profession. You walk into a lot of law firms these days, and it's like walking back in time. And I think that does a disservice to our clients. So whether it's AI or not, I think it's time for our profession to realize that it's the time where we would still get paid for those inefficiencies is coming to an end, and not to be like to take too much of a serious turn, but there's trends in the United States right now where a lot of tasks that are being done by junior associates can't really be billed for. Now, don't conflate that with the fact that that means there's no more need for junior associates. No. What that does mean, though, is there has to be a rethinking of what you can bill for, and perhaps a move away from just a standard billable hour model. So these changes are happening, and I think it's been a perfect time for AI as well, because it adds those efficiencies. So that's a long way of saying I don't think the humans will be out of the loop. And I think that it's in our best interest, obviously, not just my company, but other tools, even the ones not AI related, just efficiency tools overall.
Anyone else?
Can you describe some of the efforts put into the curation of the first training data set?
Nice. Do you come from an engineering background? Yeah, nice. So it depends what task you want it to do. So depending on what we were training it to do, what we did was work. So we were very lucky. One of our first investors was Dentons, the world's largest law firm. And so they had a large amount of data and past workflows. And then we actually started, depending on which firms we were working with, we also included some of their clients in the mix and got, a different standpoints. So we were able to look at past workflows and then train in those processes into ROS so that ROS was able to learn those patterns. So the most basic one would be, past research workflow that we then use to train into ROS what a good answer would be to various types of legal research questions. then ROS would then be released kind of live so that humans would ask it questions. And the first few times that users use ROS, maybe it was bringing you back some good results and some really bad results. And then through us having it live, we then used reinforcement learning to get it better and better.
You didn't call it Glenn. Why didn't you call it Glenn?
I didn't want you to sue me.
Who's Ross?
It was funny. We actually sat around and did like a baby naming ceremony for Ross. And it was like 3 of us trying to name a kid. And so then we ended up naming it Ross. And then now there's a whole bunch of theories why we named it Ross, which is fun. And my favorite one was we ended up meeting this great venture capitalist in Silicon Valley. And he was like, great idea, love the name, loving the name. And we were like, He's like, be right back. I'm like, okay. Came back, he was like, that name though, wonderful name. And we were like, yeah. And he was like, so when did you read the play? And I was like, I'm good at trying to hold my own on those situations, that I was like, I'm bored. So I was like, what play? And then he was like, oh, and was like really kind of like disappointed. And apparently there was the first use of the word robot was in a Czech play, as you all probably know this, from like 1920 or 1935. Someone in the crowd will correct me on the correct date, called RUR, which it was called Rossum's Universal Robots. And so the first use of the word robot was by a man who was named Rossum, who invented it. Okay. So that would have been a much better story. We thought it was a cool name.
Cool. Any other questions?
Yeah.
I just have a question regarding the internship. Now, is that only open to lawyers, or is that also open to people who are interested in coding?
It's interesting. It's both. Yeah, it's both. Yeah, we have also we even have like internships for marketing, social media, sales, every kind of different department. Yeah.
So with new tools like AI, or I guess AI specifically, do you think the improvements you get kind of make you learn less? Like, do you become dependent on the technologies, and do you think there's value in kind of knowing it actually rather than using all these tools?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think a lot of lawyers say that when they had to do research using books and libraries, it was really good when they then went on to some of the current legacy providers' platforms, because they can use them more efficiently because they actually knew where things were in the physical library. So that lended itself quite nicely to actually doing research on those platforms. But then what they also say generally is that the newer lawyers like us, who didn't have to do research in libraries, suffered from not knowing where the information was. So I think what we're trying to do is actually help you find the information you need more efficiently rather than anything. So what we see is actually speeding up the learning process of lawyers. And I can use a practical example. So in the US, a lot of the time when you get hired in your first year, you do a rotation through various different departments. They do that too at firms in Canada. And one of the early firms that we worked with, they had our product in the bankruptcy department. And one of the first year associates did not take bankruptcy in law school, but was rotated through and was given a classic situation. A partner came in, gave them kind of a very convoluted question for them to go out there and research, and then obviously said, don't get lost in the weeds, and I need it tomorrow. And so they ended up using Ross and asking a bunch of questions. The next day they were in the office, and the partner was like, this is great, you found everything I needed, do this work. And so they ended up learning really quickly within that area because they were able to find the information. So I don't think it's about replacing. You actually still have to do research. You have to look at those passages, determine if they're helpful, and interact with it. So that doesn't change. What does change, though, is some of the time that you spend reading cases that might not necessarily be as helpful for you, or kind of not even knowing how to use a platform itself. So the analogy I always used to make is, back in the day, a lot of my math teachers would say, you have to learn all this stuff because it's not like you'll ever have a calculator in your pocket all the time. And then I do. But what ended up happening was folks didn't forget how to do math. It allowed us to actually do more advanced computations. So I see that's where we're seeing this happening in law.
One last question. Simon.
Did you ever have a point in your career where you thought that coding was going to evolve the way you did that out of this?
Every day. every day, even right now, Simon, when you asked me the question. Elon Musk was talking to a group of folks, and they were talking about entrepreneurship and startups, and it's on the internet. I think there's a clip, and they asked, "Oh, so can you describe what it's like starting a startup?" And he was like, "It's like eating glass and staring into the abyss." So it's not that bad. He's an intense dude. The founder of LinkedIn, Reid Hoffman, said this, and I think this is how I think about it. It's like jumping off a very high up cliff and figuring out how to build a plane on the way down. So that's kind of how I feel a lot of the time, especially because things continue to change, and you have to keep up to that. And a lot of the time you have to do really hard decisions, like, you have to be like, okay, well, if we aren't able to prove out this within 4 weeks, that won't be good. So then you just stay up all night and you work hard at it and you make it happen. And that is why a lot of early startups fail. But I actually think the failure is not necessarily a bad thing either. And I think as a profession, we suffer from this idea where all failure is bad. But I think that's been really cool about Silicon Valley, is that people are like, yeah, so I had this great idea, and then this happened, and then I raised X amount, and then it failed, and then I did this. I'm like, wait, someone else gave you more money? And they're like, yeah, because I learned all the things that I did the first time that was wrong. And I think some of it can obviously be a bad thing, but I think what's neat about that atmosphere is that those ideas and those people end up, it's like fertilizer that then seed more ideas and more people. And so if you're interested in the space, I think you have to sing when people say, oh yeah, I feel confident since day one, they're lying to you. And I always like to say that I don't even think we've done anything yet. I feel like a lot of what we have to do is still ahead of us, and there's so much more we can do. So that's the attitude I think that's important to have. But yeah, absolutely.
Well, let me say how proud we are of you, whether you feel it or not. Thank you very much for spending time with us. I've learned there's a class coming in about 3 minutes.
Okay.
So what we're going to do is I'll get Andrew to go out by the Native Law Center out these doors. If you guys can hang out, we really would like to take some pictures. If others want to talk to Andrew, I think we can spend a few minutes. We'll just do it out here in the hallway.
Yep.
But join me in thanking Andrew Arruda.
Thanks, guys.
And here's a little gift for you.
Thank you. Thank you.